this 70th episode of Communio Sanctorum, History of the Christian Church. I want to thank all of you who've subscribed to the Into His Image YouTube channel. If you've been enjoying the content that I'm posting here and find value in it, would you please let others know? Thanks. Now, back to the scholastics. Begun by the work of Abelard and Anselm, scholasticism came into its own as a movement when the Greek philosopher Aristotle was kind of rediscovered by the scholars of Europe. The Crusades had made contact with Muslim scholars who debated Aristotle's philosophy. Their thoughts returned with the Crusaders and were passed on to the theological schools that were located in the mendicant orders of the Dominicans and the Franciscans. These were the groups that the church at that time had invested with the study of theology. During the mid-13th century, there was something of an Aristotelian revival in these schools. Now, it's interesting that at the dawn of that century, the reading of Aristotle had been banned. After all, he was a pagan Greek. What could Christians learn from him? But, as any college knows, there's one way to make sure that something gets read. Ban it. Put a prohibition on it. And so a couple of decades later, portions of Aristotle were allowed to be read. By mid-century, he was required reading, and both he and his mentor Plato and his teacher Socrates were kind of unofficially baptized and made over into, well, pre-Christian saints. Now, it makes sense that Aristotle's philosophy would be resurrected when we remember that the goal of the scholastics was to apply reason to faith, to seek to understand with the rational mind what the Spirit already believed. It was Aristotle who developed the rules of logic. During the Middle Ages in Europe, all learning took place under the watchful eye of the Church. Theology reigned supreme among the sciences. Philosophers like Aristotle, the Muslim Averroes, and the Jew Maimonides were studied alongside the Bible. Scholars were especially fascinated by Aristotle. He seemed to have explained the entire universe not by using scripture, but by his powers of observation and reason. Now, for some of the ultra-conservatives, this emphasis on reason threatened to undermine traditional belief. Christians had come to think that knowledge could come only through God's revelation, that only those to whom God chose to reveal truth could understand the universe. Well, how could this be squared with the knowledge taught by these newly discovered philosophies? The pinnacle of scholastic theology arrived with Thomas Aquinas. His work forever shaped the direction of Catholicism. In fact, his influence was so profound, he was given the title Doctor Angelicus, the angelic doctor. Aquinas was born in 1225 in Roccasecca, Italy, to Count Lundolf of Aquino and his wife Theodora. The youngest of 9, it was clear at a young age that Thomas would be a big kid. At 5, he was sent to a school at the nearby monastery of Monte Cassino that Benedict had started 700 years before. At 19, Thomas went to the University of Naples, where his Dominican teacher so impressed him that Thomas decided that he too would join the new, study-oriented Dominican order. Now, his family fiercely opposed this, hoping that he'd become a wealthy abbot or archbishop rather than take the mendicant's vow of poverty. Thomas's brothers kidnapped and confined him for over a year. His family even tempted him with a prostitute and an offer to buy him the Archbishopric of Naples. But Thomas would have none of it. He went to Paris, medieval Europe's headquarters of theological study. And there it was that he came under the spell of the Dominican scholar Albertus Magnus, also known as Albert the Great. When Thomas began his studies, no one would suspect the future that lay before him. He was colossally obese, much of his size due to edema. At that time it was called dropsy. He had one huge eye that dwarfed the other and gave his face a kind of distorted aspect that many people found disconcerting. Socially, he was anything but the dynamic, charismatic figure that some might assume. You know, something to make up for his awkward physical appearance. Aquinas was introspective, silent most of the time. When he did speak, what he said often had nothing to do with the conversation at hand. In college, his classmates called him the dumb ox, a title that seemed apropos for both appearance and his behavior. What people didn't realize till much later was the incredibly keen mind behind the unassuming exterior and the brilliant way that he was able to marshal his thoughts into persuasive language that others could understand. Now remember, the goal of the scholastics was to provide a rational understanding to what Christians believe. Aquinas gave critical support to such doctrines as the attributes of God, the resurrection, and ex nihilo creation, that is, creation out of nothing. While these are things that most Christians hold to, Aquinas also provided support for distinctly Roman Catholic beliefs, such as the veneration of Mary, purgatory, the role of human merit in salvation, and the 7 sacraments by which God conveys grace through the Roman clergy. He also gave much support to transubstantiation. That's the idea that the communion elements are turned into the literal body and blood of Christ in the Mass. His theological and philosophical musings covered a wide range from metaphysics to ethics, politics, and of course theology. Socially awkward, he frequently drifted into the internal world of his mind, where he became oblivious to what was happening around him. In fact, according to one account, as he was dining with King Louis IX of France, while others engaged in conversation, Thomas just stared off into space, lost in thought. Now, either forgetting or not caring where he was, he slammed his fist on the table and he shouted, there's an argument that will destroy the Manichaeans," which, of course, as you may remember, was a heretical group from ages before. But the problem was, no one at the table had been talking about the Manichaeans or anything even close to that. Though seated at the same table as the king and other important dignitaries, Aquinas was mentally seated somewhere entirely else. Aquinas was heavily influenced by Aristotelian philosophy, which he'd studied during his time in Paris. All of that, though, was shaped by traditional Christian theology, particularly the work of Augustine. One of the most important contributions that Aquinas made to philosophical inquiry came from his long pondering on being. He differentiated between the being that is objective essence and the reality of a thing, the esse naturale, and the expression of that thing which is perceived in the mind, the esse intentionale. Aquinas argued that essence precedes perception and is the foundation of all being. Now, discussion around Aquinas' position on being becomes one of the central debates of later philosophy, and perhaps the main divide between modernity and postmodernism. Aquinas' work on ethics flows from the idea of natural law. Now, he reasoned that human beings have a natural inclination towards certain good things, like life, knowledge, relationships. These good things are objectively good and part of natural law, that is, the moral law that governs all human behavior. For Aquinas, that which is good is that which leads ultimately to human flourishing. In this he aligned with some of the more refined of the ancient Greek philosophers. Thomas's political ideas flowed naturally from his ethics. If ethics were centered on individual good, well, politics was based on the common good. He maintained that the purpose of civil government was to promote that common good. But he made a distinction between divine law and human law. While both laws aim at human flourishing, divine law related primarily to morality and was revealed by God, while human law was derived by people working in concert to order their society around behaviors that promoted the common good. But Aquinas' real theological magnum opus, maybe his greatest contribution, was titled Summa Theologica. It begins by distinguishing between philosophy and theology, that is, between reason and revelation. Contrary to what some had claimed, true theology and philosophy do not contradict each other. Each are avenues of knowledge ordained by God. Following Aristotle's lead, Thomas proposed that reason is based on what our senses tell us, what we can see, feel, hear, smell, and touch. Revelation is based on more. While reason can lead us to belief in God, something other theologians like Anselm had already said, only revelation can show us God as he really is, the God who reveals himself in the Bible. Philosophy makes clear the existence of God, but only theology based on revelation tells us what the God who exists is like. Thomas accepted Aristotle's principle that every effect has a cause, and every cause a prior cause, and so on back to a first cause. He declared creation traces back to a divine first cause, the Creator. However, the full knowledge of God, the Trinity, for example, comes only through revelation. From this knowledge, we discover man's origin and destiny. Now, Aquinas went on. Man is a sinner in need of special grace from God. Jesus Christ, by his sacrifice, has secured the reconciliation of man and God. All who receive the benefits of Christ's works are justified. But the key, as in traditional Catholic teaching, lies in the way that the benefits of Christ's work are applied. Christ won grace, but the church imparts it. Aquinas taught that Christians need the constant infusion of what he called cooperating grace, whereby Christian virtues are stimulated in the soul. Assisted by this cooperating grace, a Christian can do works that please God and, gain special merit in God's sight. Now, this grace, said Aquinas, comes to people only through the divinely appointed sacraments placed in the keeping of the church, by which he meant the visible, organized Roman Church, led by the magisterium, and that headed by the Pope. So convinced was Aquinas of the divine authority of the papacy, he insisted that submission to the Pope was necessary to be saved. Now, following an earlier scholastic, Peter of Lombard, Aquinas held to 7 sacraments as the means by which the church imparts grace. He said that since sin remains a problem for the baptized believer, God provided penance, a sacrament that made for spiritual healing. With some caution, Thomas also accepted the practice of indulgences that had gained acceptance during the Crusades. Aquinas taught that thanks to the work of Christ and the meritorious deeds of the saints, the church had an access to a kind of treasury of merit, a great spiritual reservoir of excess goodness. Now, priests were able to draw from this reservoir to aid Christians who had insufficient merit of their own. Think of the treasury of merit this way. There are today some cooperative health insurance groups that have been established whereby people make payments into a fund that acts as a kind of reservoir of capital. And when those who have contributed have a medical need, they apply to a gatekeeper steward who decides if their request for financial assistance is merited. The treasury of merit worked kind of like that, except the only contributors to the treasury were saints, especially holy people who produced an excess of good, the excess in this case being beyond what they needed to merit the qualification of obtaining saving grace. Now, if that sounds contrary to the gospel of grace, welcome to the debate that will later tear the church in two during the Reformation. Obviously, we're going to be coming back to the subject of indulgences when we get to that period of church history. Aquinas said that the wicked pass into hell, while the faithful who wisely use the means of grace pass immediately into heaven. But the bulk of Christians who'd followed Christ inadequately, they had to suffer purification in a purgatory, before ascending to the joys of heaven. Thankfully, these souls are not beyond the help of the church on earth. Prayers to the saints and special masses could relieve the pains of souls in purgatory, said Aquinas. There was nothing new in all of this. It had been said many times before, but Thomas set the traditional teaching of the church in a cosmic framework. His writings, and there were more than what were contained in the Summa, were attacked before he was in his grave. In 1277, the Archbishop of Paris tried to have Thomas condemned, but the Roman clergy put a stop to it. Though Thomas was canonized in 1325, it took another 200 years before his teachings were hailed as preeminent and a major rebuttal to Protestantism. His writings played a prominent role in the Counter-Reformation's Council of Trent. While Aquinas was prized for his writings and his teaching, to his delight, he was never made a bishop. He was known to blend deep meditations on theology with personal devotion that was so intense he became oblivious to what was happening around him. Over the years, he had numerous visions, but one in early December of 1273, while celebrating the Mass, saw him in a prolonged ecstasy that ended his attempts to put his ideas into writing. When his secretary begged him to pick up his pen and continue, Aquinas replied, quote, "I cannot. Such things have been revealed to me that what I have already written seems but straw," unquote. His Summa Theologica, one of the most influential writings in all of church history, was left unfinished when he died just 3 months later. In 1879, a papal bull endorsed Aquinas' theology, today called Thomism, as an authentic expression of doctrine and said that it should be studied by all students of theology. Both Protestant and Catholic scholars study his work deeply to this day.